Hello boys and girls. Well, it's nice to see you again, and I know there's folks out there, boys and girls, who are watching from all parts of Northern Ireland and people from further away. I think there's even people out there in Scotland and Malaysia. So you're very welcome as we move on to our next chapter of Mr. Mousey Beyond the Silver Sea. Well, the best way to get going is just to get going. So we've moved into chapter 5, and if you remember at the end of chapter 4, they have just discovered, and Mr. Mousey, or Mr. Rabbit, has thrown out of the, the hole in the tree a rug. Yes, a rug. Doesn't seem very exciting. Let's see where it goes next. Chapter 5, the carpet. Is that all there was in there? Asked Mr. Mousey. It was hard not to be incredibly disappointed. After all, they had walked the most of the day into the wildlands, far from home, and it would have been only natural for them to expect some kind of a reward. Apart from a few slugs, said Mr. Rabbit, but then they weren't going to count anyway. He looked thoughtful. Do we throw it back in before we head back, or do we just leave it here? Mr. Mousey was thinking. Does it seem normal to you to find a carpet in a tree? I thought it was a rug. Carpet, rug, whatever. But how would it have got there? Who cares? At the minute I'm hungry and wondering if you're planning on heading home anytime soon. The answer to Mr. Rabbit's question was very soon answered in a way that neither would have planned. Not for no reason were the wild lands so called. They lay just outside whatever influences it was that kept the woods the haven of security that they remained. Strange things that could find no entrance there brooded in the shadow of these valleys. It was as the mouse and the rabbit stood facing each other over the unrolled carpet that they heard the far-off howl. Its solitary tone was soon cancelled by an answering howl coming from a slightly different direction, but if anything, somewhat nearer. Right, commanded the mouse. We've done what we came for. Grab your pack. We're heading back. Mr. Rabbit didn't need to be told twice. Within seconds, he was buckled up, his eyes large, his attention focused on the mouse. Whatever it was that was howling in the distance, it made his fur stand on end and his tail stick out behind him in the way it did when he was genuinely afraid. It was when situations like this came about he was glad to have Mr. Mousey as his friend. He never seemed to panic. Coolly and calmly, he always seemed to have a grasp of the situation, and so the rabbit stood ready to follow his pal's advice. Can't forget this. Mr. Mousey quickly rolled up the carpet and buckled it onto the top of his backpack. He studied the direction from which the howls had come and turned the way they had come. Heading off, they left the oak glen behind them and hastily retraced their steps to the stony pathway. Checking his bearings, the mouse wasted no time and quickly led the way, heading north, striking out for the river crossing some miles ahead. They had only been walking a minute or two when they heard the second set of calls. Whatever the creatures were, they howled again in blood-curdling chorus, but this time considerably louder than before. They were now moving along at almost a trot, Mr. Mousey leading the way with his face fixed in determination, Mr. Rabbit following, though he was finding it hard going. He still carried his heavy pack, and for a second he considered dumping it. Only for a second, however. Some actions he reckoned were just a little bit too drastic to seriously consider. After all, there was a lot of good grub in there. They wound their way back through the barren hills, following the path, and were making good ground. The little mouse was in the act of turning around to speak to his friend when the third series of howls soared the air. This time there was no doubting it. Whatever it was that was making the chilling sounds, it was behind them and getting closer. "Wolves!" cried Mr. Mousey. "Wild-land wolves! I've heard stories of them, of wicked, big grey animals that haunt the borders of the woods, seeking out lost travellers and..." He stopped. He didn't want to scare his pal any more, though, to be honest, he didn't think he could look more frightened. Also, he didn't want to waste time talking. The creatures that were stalking them were moving much faster than they were. If they didn't think of something soon, they would be overtaken before they reached the river. "I don't want to be eaten alive!" cried Mr. Rabbit. "Come to that, I don't fancy much being eaten dead either. What are we going to do? Ah!" The reason Mr. Rabbit gave a yell at the end of his sentence was due to the fact he was suddenly jumped on by the mouse. "What are you doing? Get off me! Mr. Mousey, what are you..." "Stop struggling, Mr. Rabbit," burst out his mousy pal. "I need into your pack." "This is no time to get hungry, Mr. Mousey. Besides, you've got your own." "But not for a couple of wolves," interrupted the mouse. "Quick, spread this out across the ground." Mr. Mousey had leapt upon Mr. Rabbit's pack and had already pulled out a string of raw sausages and a couple of squashed bread rolls. The somewhat shocked rabbit was also rather indignant and was about to tell Mr. Mousey exactly what he thought about his thieving and pillaging when from a distance of less than a quarter of a mile off, a loud, excited baying and wailing drowned out their speech. Catching on now what his friend was about, he helped throw out a dozen pancakes and a pair of herring. "Now, let's move as fast as we can and pray that this works," said Mr. Mousey. Without so much as looking over their shoulders, they kicked off, Mr. Rabbit's dismay over the loss of good food being slightly tempered by the realization that he was feeling the benefit of a lighter pack. They had only been going for a couple of minutes when they heard an almighty ruckus behind them on the trail. Howling and tearing could be distinctly made out by at least two animals. Sounds like they've found our picnic," puffed Mr. Mousey. "If it works really well, they may even forget about us altogether." They weren't to be so lucky. They had covered about half a mile when the howls resumed. Something about the cries told them that once again they were the prey, and it was not a good feeling. This time Mr. Rabbit didn't need to be jumped on. He had the pack half off his back when the mouse turned to face him. "Good on you, Mr. Rabbit. What would I do without a friend like you?" Mr. Rabbit was feeling exactly the same way about the mouse, and though it was the strangest time to do so, they smiled at one another in a way that said, "You are just my best friend." This time they left a good half of the contents, including a bag of flour and half a chicken. Mr. Mousey marvelled at the sheer amount of produce that Mr. Rabbit had on his back, and where on earth he had been able to get it in all the short space of time that they had had to pack. Wasting as little time as possible, they were off again, this time almost at a run. With the now much lighter load of Mr. Rabbit's pack and the very real urgency of reaching the river, they were covering ground at a remarkable pace for two small animals. But not remarkable enough. Again they heard the baying as the brutes following them came across the bait, but the chasing howls resumed again in an alarmingly short space of time. Mustn't have liked the chicken," panted Mr. Rabbit. More likely they're onto our scheme, and they're coming after us, food on the trail or not." "Do you think they would like turkey?" asked Mr. Rabbit as they tumbled along, sweat glistening on their noses. Mr. Mousey shook his head, not in a negative reply, but amazement. "A turkey? Or what about custard and peaches?" "I think," gasped the mouse, "I think we'll just have to make a dash for it." The river had been in view to their right now for quite some time, and the path was gradually bearing them closer and closer. Mr. Mousey knew, however, that a good mile and a half still lay ahead to the crossing, and even once there, would the wolves follow them across the river or not? It didn't seem like they were going to find out this last part anyway. The horrible howling had come to within 200 or 300 yards. On a quick glance back, Mr. Mousey caught a fleeting glimpse of huge shadowy forms racing down the path behind before they disappeared into the valley they had only just left. Mr. Mousey undid his backpack straps, about to throw off his pack. As he breathlessly began to tell his friend to do the same for extra speed, 3 things happened. One was that the hip strap for his pack wrapped itself around his ankles, causing him to fall headlong into a flying dive. The second being that as he fell, he let go of the roll of carpet, which spun, unrolling itself in the air as it spun above him. The third, equally dramatic, was that the rabbit, following hard on his friend's heels, tripped on the hapless mouse laid out before him and ended up falling on top with a loud gasp. The carpet, which was still airborne, landed on top, completely covering them both. In slow motion, the whole scene would have looked very impressive indeed. In normal time, it was a lot less eventful, just a whoa and a ah and a woof. There were a few seconds where neither spoke, or more accurately, where neither was able to speak. Mr. Mousey was winded and near enough knocked out by the fall. The rabbit coming down on him like a ton of bricks mere tenths of a second later did little to help. For his part, Mr. Rabbit found himself in almost darkness, totally at a loss to understand why everything had suddenly gone so black. Feeling something warm and soft beneath him, he started to speak. "Mr. Mousey, is that you down there?" He was silenced by a shh. It was Mr. Mousey. It sounded like he was leaking air. "Are you all right?" "Shh! Quiet!" came Mr. Mousey's whispered voice. The next noises came neither from the mouse nor the rabbit. The galloping of rough, clawed paws approaching at fearful speed chilled Mr. Rabbit's heart. He caught his breath and held it close, not daring to breathe. Below him he could vaguely make out the outline of Mr. Mousey's head. The chasing slowed to a padding, followed by a slobbering, snuffling sound. A low growl advanced and seemed to hang directly above Mr. Rabbit's head. "So this is how it ends," thought the rabbit to himself. "Attacked and devoured by invisible wolves, and none to know why we never returned." There was a strange comfort in knowing that his last moments on earth were going to be spent with his greatest friend and ally, and although he was immensely afraid, this thought helped him to be able to think more clearly and rob a little bit of the blind terror. It was about now he was able to see that they must both be lying under the carpet, and even understanding that helped. All of a sudden, a hideous howl thundered across his thoughts, followed by a wailing and a yowling. The noise lasted for what felt like hours, but in fact was probably less than half a minute. Just as suddenly, the noise ceased, and the sound of several pawed feet moving back the way they had come announced that the wolves were returning back along the trail. They were sniffing the air and scratching at something as they left, but left they did. After a space of about 2 minutes, Mr. Rabbit dared to speak again, this time in a whisper. "Mr. Mousey!" A low grunt from below was all that he heard, so he tried again. "Mr. Mousey, are you okay?" The replying grunt was, "Mr. Mousey, all right?" Not if you don't get off me right now, Mr. Rabbit." The rabbit rolled off, and in doing so knocked off the covering carpet. Mr. Mousey was lying flat out on the dirt, looking for all the world as if he had dropped to earth from 2 miles high. He groaned as he rolled over onto his back and looked into the pale face of his friend. "Oh, you need to go on a diet," he said flatly. "Do you have any idea how heavy you are, Mr. Rabbit?" He groaned again as Mr. Rabbit helped him to his feet. "I think they're gone," whispered Mr. Rabbit. Mr. Mousey was stretching his sore body. "To be honest, I was just about to tell them they could have me any time soon anyway," he said, proceeding to bend over side to side in a series of exercises. "You weren't!" exclaimed the shocked voice of the rabbit. After I'd invited them to have a bit of rabbit stew, of course," winked Mr. Mousey. "That's not even funny," said Mr. Rabbit, scowling at the mouse, who was now doing sit-ups before him. "I held off an entire flock of killer wolves while you lay there having a nap." I think that's entire pack," responded his friend, breathing and breaking into a smile. "Whatever," said the rabbit. "Now, what do you suppose has just happened?" asked the mouse, examining the enormous paw prints that clearly showed 2 or 3 large animals had approached and had gone back the way they had come. Mr. Rabbit shrugged. He really had no idea, but it truly did seem as if the animals had indeed gone, and relief was beginning to hit him in waves. "Mr. Mousey, for a while I was sure we were dead ducks, or at least a dead mouse and a dead rabbit. Wasn't it dreadful? Isn't it great to be alive? Oh, I feel so hungry now. Where is that piece of chicken I had?" Mr. Mousey was deep in thought. We were covered by the carpet, but how would that fool wild land wolves? Even they can't be that foolish. "I'm sure I had a piece of chicken in here somewhere," Mr. Rabbit muttered as he rummaged through his pack. Mr. Mousey looked at the carpet laid out before him. "I mean, it's not as if it's even camouflaged. Look at it. It's red and gold with bits of blue." Well, it was a question that would have to wait. It was beginning to head towards evening, and already the light was fading. "Come on, Mr. Rabbit. Another 20 minutes and we'll be across the river, where I suggest we make camp." The rest of the journey to the crossing was uneventful. Mr. Mousey's mind filled with questions of their survival and how the carpet somehow fitted into that, while Mr. Rabbit was thinking mostly about chicken. After crossing the stream, they settled for the little dale they had seen the first time they had come this way that afternoon. They undid their packs, and Mr. Mousey stretched out a canvas over a couple of hastily set up branches. The carpet made an excellent ground sheet. A small fire was lit, and as darkness fell, they enjoyed a well-earned supper. The mouse had the last of his cheese and chive sandwiches, while Mr. Rabbit stuffed himself with turkey and custard. Yep, turkey and custard. The stars were twinkling in their clustered millions as Mr. Mousey looked up, hearing beside him on the carpet his friend's gentle snores. He was still rehearsing in his head their remarkable escape from the ravenous wolves. He could come to only one conclusion, and having at last found some kind of an answer, was able to find sleep. As he slipped into his dreams, he thought through his answer one last time. It's the carpet. It's a magic carpet. Well, that's the end of that chapter, boys and girls. I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll go on to chapter 6 next time, and we'll see you then. God bless. Take care. Bye.